folks. Thanks for your patience. I think we'll get started to honor your time. Um, Today, I'm going to be going through the steps to help you get set up with GoGuardian Teacher, talk a little bit about it. We've had a few people trying it here the first few weeks, last couple of weeks, and have learned a few things. And so, hope to share some of that information with you. And then stick around to answer questions that you have to help support you and make sure that you're successful with implementing it. So thanks for joining us today. You're welcome to, if your mic isn't muted, please do so right now. And then that will kind of help us with some of the audio. And then as we continue on, we'll um, be able to ask questions later once I'm done presenting. So thank you. So the whole idea of GoGuardian Teacher is that we've had GoGuardian as a web filter. We've been using it for several years. It's giving us alerts to administrators, to our media folks about inappropriate behavior. We address that sometimes, put some restrictions on there, and then we can also give reports to parents on history um, if they request that. And it does also give us some good data analytics on our tool use back when we were trying to decide if some of the tools that we had been using were really getting use. We could go to GoGuardian and look and see how many people were using it on any given day. And that was really useful information for us as we were going through that. So the teacher tool has some additional features for you as a teacher to manage your students in class. And as I think back, it would have been great to have last year, but unfortunately, because we had some students with personal devices and some without, it kind of made it difficult to do that. But it gives you the ability to um, see where students are going, to lock screens. It gives you a little bit more control. But I will say that it's important to think about when we want to use that control. Is it something that we want have an educational benefit for, or is it something that we just uh, want to control because we can? For example, sometimes you have the ability to, in your scenes, that you can set up to limit the number of tabs. And some people are like, well, it's great. I can now limit to 6 tabs total. And that's not necessarily a research-based reason to do it. Now, to say on an assessment, for example, I'm going to limit it to 1 or 2 tabs, that to me makes a little bit more sense. But we'll talk about that because when you're creating the scenes that we'll talk about in a minute that give you either these are the sites that are allowed or these are the sites that are not allowed, when you're setting up those scenes, you can kind of think about, is it just that for this next hour I don't want them chatting? That's great. You can set it up that way. But I know that one of the folks on the call today has been using it and said, okay, for my curriculum, these are the sites that I for sure want them to have access to. Now, if a student then says, I need to be able to access this other site, and there's a good educational reason, that can be added to the list. And so there can be that shared ownership of which ones are going to be useful for that particular class. And so that's something that you can consider doing. And then you can also, one of the things that I'm going to talk about is rather than setting up calendars where it's going to automatically happen, if there's any change in schedules, that can really mess things up. So I think it's really important as we start off to um, manually turn things on, set a specific amount of time, and then turn it off so that if students are complete with your work, they can go on to other classes and do other things in other curriculum. So we'll talk about that in a second. It's not a set it and forget it. It's one tool for you to utilize. Remember that you still have the ability to say, all right, everybody, for right now, we're closing our screens. And the expectation of doing that and practicing doing that with students, or going to 45 if need be. Making sure that you're walking around the room, or even on an assessment where you might have GoGuardian turned on, having you positioned in such a way that you can see screens and talk to kids and interact if need be. So there's an overview video in our presentation. We're not going to talk about that, but here's some examples. Sometimes maybe it's one or two kids who are struggling with directed focus, so you could add some limits to them to help them uh, with their executive function, and then slowly, gradually release it back to them as you go through. Um, so we've gone through and done some testing, worked on kind of the level of teacher responsibility on some things. And for right now, we're doing some limited piloting with folks that had initially signed up, but eventually we'll be rolling this out to everybody. Um, it has a lot of features. Some of those features are ones that we're already using with other tools. So Control H can give you the history right off the bat. If you have a question about what a student's doing, you can always see that. We're using Meet for our video conferencing. I say don't use GoGuardian's video conferencing because we've already got Meet. The lesson recording, we've already got WeVideo. We've got Loom for doing different recordings and things like that. Snapshots too. We're using Awesome Screenshot and other stuff. So when you're going to set up your classes, they're going to sync with the campus roster. So we've already done that, but you can also create extra sections. If you've got a recurring flex, for example, you could set up a recurring section and add students to that so that you can support them if you're doing an activity that's going beyond just 1 or 2 days. So the first thing that you need to do is go to GoGuardian Teacher. And so I'm going to jump over to that screen. And whoops, I'm on GoGuardian right now. So I'm going to go to teacher.goguardian.com. And when that comes up, if you haven't signed in before, you'll sign in with Google. And when you initially sign in, you're going to see that in the pending section, you're going to have classes. And that's where you're going to add those classes to active. Now, unfortunately, the way that the tool that we use to do the syncing, Clever, is naming our courses is not very convenient. It gives a really long course. And so what you may end up having to do is kind of look at each section and look in your campus roster to see which one is which. One thing you can do in the sections is you can set up color coding for them. So for example, if I go into my active sections, I've got a 6th grade, I've got the entire 6th grade as a class because it's one of our Z groups that I manage. And if I go into edit that class, one of the things that I can do is say, okay, for that group, I'm going to make it this color and update the classroom. And so now when I go in and look at my active classes, I'll see that that color is there as a way to kind of help me. So you can do some color coding. You know, maybe your A days are coded one way and your B days are coded another way, as a way to kind of keep track of that. And that's something that you can kind of set up custom wise. So in the pending, you're going to see activate in the bottom right hand corner. And so you're going to go ahead and do that. And so you just need to, whoops, go back here. So you'll see that accept, and you'll go through and do that on each of those classes. So you'll want to accept those. I've got a question coming in the chat. Can you rename the classes? The renaming is not possible right now. I think it's better to leave it because we want to make sure that the sync is working properly. So for right now, I would say no. We'll do some testing to see if it has an impact. But for right now, I suggest that you leave the naming there as we go through that. So good question there. Sorry. All right. So once you've gone through and accepted, now those classes go from pending to active. And I would even say, some people were like, well, do I do my advisory too? I would say yes, because there may be times where you do want to have students do some specific things, and having it set up in advance would be helpful. So now, um, as we're taking a look here, the next thing is that when you have a class set up, and I'm going to come back over to my actives, I have a course and section that's kind of a practice one that I have set up here. And I can say I want to start this class, or if I click on it, it's going to bring up information about that class. And I'm going to say, I'm going to do a 30-minute session here. For the next 30 minutes, I'm going to apply some things to this class and set some things up. And it gives me the option of adding a scene. Now, when you first start, you don't have any scenes, and now I've developed some, and those scenes are over here on the left-hand side. So when you click on scenes, as I said earlier, it's going to show you the allowed lists, and you can create them. I've assigned a couple lists here, and then you've got block website lists. So for example, this one is, all I want to do is turn off GChat during the time. I can do that. I've got another one that is GChat, YouTube, and some Google sites that have games on them. I can block that. Now realize, when you block those Google sites with games, you're blocking all Google sites. So if you plan on needing to use Google sites with your kids, you wouldn't want to include that one. Unfortunately, that's the only way you can block all of those games. But let's say I want to create a new list. So if I click on the allowed website list and say create list, first thing is ask you to name it. So I'll do sample list here. And you can describe it if you want to. You can set a color to that list. I'll go with yellow this time. And then you click next. And then we're going to start searching for the sites that we would want to allow on this list. So for example, perhaps I want to use a site like Canva for my students to do some memes. Like yesterday, we had a teacher who was doing some memes, and so we suggested, hey, what about Canva? Because that would be a great site for that. And here it is, canva.com. So I'm going to click add. And so now that has been added to the list of approved sites. Well, maybe I'm also pushing out some information in Schoology. Well, if I want to add Schoology, it turns out that there's a few other things I need to add. And if we go to quick lists here, it's going to show that some of the lists have been built. Now, these are a couple that were built by us in the district as kind of practice, and we can add others to that. But down here, GoGuardian has also made some. For example, if you want to use Kahoot with your students, there's actually 3 sites that are needed in order to make that work. And so you could check that box and it would add that to there. If you're using Kami, there's actually 2 sites you need. Schoology, also 2. So in this case, I want to make sure I have Schoology checked, because I'm going to be pushing out this activity and they may be submitting it within Schoology. And then I'd come out and say add to scene. So now they've got access to Schoology, and they're going to have access to Canva. And those are the only ones that they might have. Now, as far as the limit of tabs, in this case, with Schoology and Canva, probably saying 2 tabs or 3 tabs would be fine. For right now, I'm going to say 3 tabs. And once I have that in place, now I can go ahead and hit save. So now in my list, I've got this sample list of allowed sites. So when I come back to my classrooms and I'm in this classroom, I'm going to say that I'm going to apply that scene for my students. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to say sample list. I'm not going to exclude any of the students from the session, and it's going to be on for 30 minutes. So I say start the session. Now, I'm going to stop sharing this way right now in our Meet because I want to be able to share the entire desktop so you can see everything that's going on here. All right. So down in my browser, I have Marvin Mouse, who is a student in my class. And notice that Marvin had 3 tabs open. One was Edina Schools, I believe. One was the student site. But notice what happens once I've applied that scene to Marvin, who was working on stuff. It gives them a message that you've reached a website that isn't, your teacher doesn't want you to browse. So I can get to Schoology. That's working just fine. And I can go in and I can look at other things in Schoology. I can even click on a link inside of Schoology. And if it opens inside of Schoology, that site is still there, even though I didn't add this humanities site to my list of allowed sites. So one of the things we found, and that's why we kind of were slow in rolling it out because we wanted to test some of this, is that even though you've got a site here that isn't on your allowed list, or even a YouTube video, because it's embedded within Schoology, it's allowing that site to display for the student. And so that was something that is important to note, and we'll talk about that when it comes to assessment. But this one here is not. It happened to be the portal site. So let's say I want to go to, the teacher says I have to go to Canva. So Canva is allowed, and it's allowing me to get there. But let's say over here, I want to go to Google. Oh, that says I can't go there. Let's say I want to open another tab and try and go somewhere else. Oop, right off the bat, it closed that tab right away because it didn't allow me to go there. Okay, so it allowed me to go to Schoology, allowed me to go to Canva, but not others. Okay, now I'm going to pause because I've been talking a lot and answer any questions that you might have. Yeah, so David asked the question about something like amplify science within Schoology. My belief is that yes, it would work based on the testing that we've done, and it's something that you can try. But it seems because it's integrated within Schoology, it's going to work. Now, any link in Schoology that's set to open in a new window, that would not necessarily work, and so that's something to be careful of. Now, I'm going to jump over to my environment here, and I'm going to actually end the session because I want to, and when I end the session, it gets me a question of how did it go. I'm going to say it went well, and you'll note that in the timelines now, it shows that Marvin was in a class and he tried to get to some different things, and it shows Marvin's timeline of all the sites that he went to. For your other classes, it's going to show all of that. You're also going to get an email report, and in that email report, it's going to give you information about that session, how engaged kids were, and some other things that you can kind of see. And you can also access those student reports here in the class under student reports on your screen, and you can select students, you can do a date range and view that report. It gives you a quick email if you want to email it to parents and say, hey, maybe I turned the session on but I didn't block anything, just to kind of see how it goes. And that's something that I would recommend you try. But maybe you've got a situation where a student is going to to sites are not using their time wisely, you can quickly email that report to parents and say, hey, let's have a conversation with the student. Okay. All right. I'm going to pause for a moment, and if you want to unmute your mic with any other questions that you have at this point. Well, I mean, letting the kids know that you're able to view what they're doing and that it's recording what they're doing is, for a lot of kids, going to be a deterrent, and they're going to comply more because they know that that's something they probably shouldn't be doing, right? Um, and so that's something that other teachers have found. I know in talking with a few teachers at Valley View, that just having it on and saying, hey, this is, we're using this as a tool to kind of help you focus and get your work done, has been really an effective thing. And I know I've talked to Sam about this too, and I don't know, Sam, if you want to jump in on that of how it's worked for you. Right. Sam, if I could ask, how are you using it the entire class period, or how have you done it? Right. Yeah. Do you think if it was a block class, how do you think you would change that? Hmm. Yeah. I know, to your point about the filter catching things or even accidentally finding things, Mary and I had an experience yesterday where the main filter was filtering, kids were doing legitimate research on stereotypes around toys and typed in girls' toys, and it was saying, whoa, wait a minute, and it was blocking them. Um, and I was a little naive at the time, going, "Well, why is that happening?" And then I was like, "Oh," and so it was kind of a fun conversation to, or not necessarily, but a conversation to have with the eighth graders to explain why that was, and how maybe including the word stereotype and other things to kind of help narrow the search. Yes, Mary. Oops, I'm sorry. You're muted. Exactly. I mean, they could include that as part of the report, right? I mean, that's really interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Um, in the setup, let me look here. I believe you can do some of that, but I think like you can exclude a student from like the allowed. So maybe in that case, I would exclude that student so that they could get to more sites. And then if it turned out that they were going on to inappropriate, maybe um, you'd have to add those sites that work for that kid to the full list, kind of a thing, maybe. But I haven't played around enough with it to know that, and I don't know if anybody on the call has had to deal with that situation yet. Yeah, yeah, right, right. Hmm. Alex, did you have anything to add? Hmm. Bob, did you have something? Okay, yeah, no problem. One thing I wanted to point out, and we discovered it in the testing, and I need to bring up my site here. Must have closed out. I'll present again. But for my class, one of the things that I put together is an assessment uh, list. And in that assessment list, I included Schoology, I included uh, Edpuzzle, Pear Deck, and some other things that I thought kids might need as part of that. But then in that assessment time list, I set the tabs to two. And the reason I set it to two was because I felt as though we needed to make sure that it included both the uh, Schoology, for example, if the assessment was going to be done through Schoology, but also the portal, because obviously, in order to get to Schoology, they needed to go to the portal. But here's an interesting thing that I found. So if I start this session, and so now Marvin has that session set, and if Marvin tries to do anything in Canva, it's probably going to, it's taking a while. Oh, now it's found. Okay, so it took a while for Marvin to see that had been turned on, but now it's been turned on, and Marvin can't get to Canva anymore. But if Marvin tries to go to Schoology, he can get back to those course materials. Whoops. So Marvin's in Schoology. And again, remember I said that you could have two tabs open. Well, one thing I discovered, let's say the test is in seventh grade social studies. and the assessment is up here, for example. Well, watch what Marvin can do. I can right click on the tab and duplicate, and because it's set to 2 tabs, I'm able to get there. So now I can be here and I can go into the assessment and start taking the assessment, but I can also be over here and I can still go in, and if I've got access to these resources for the unit, I can be going in and finding primary resources to help me answer the questions that might be on the test. And so as you're setting things up, and if you're going to use Schoology for the assessment, it's probably a good idea to take that assessment and move it out of the unit folder and maybe unpublish the unit folder so that the materials that the student might access on there are not accessible. Now you can also look and see, how many tabs are up, and if you see a student has got 2 Schoology tabs open, that might be a conversation. And that's why I say, as we're using this tool, it's important to remember that you still have other ways of managing your class. Having students kind of facing one way so that you can be behind the screens to see the screens, walking around, you know, those things are still going to be important in your toolbox, not just having access to this. Um, because my biggest fear was that the opportunities to build relationships and connections with kids would go away because people would want to be sitting behind their screen to monitor what kids are doing. And so that's where it's kind of important to kind of have that balance, and also remember that you have other tools in the toolbox to support you. So any other questions or things from folks here? So on when you want chat to be off, th- this is the URL that you should use. So it's in the blocked list. Hmm, interesting. So we'll have to. I'll come down and look at your list when we're done here, and we can kind of play with that. Yeah. Remember that if you add things with an asterisk, that means that anything beyond that. And so if it's in an allow, like if you did mail.google.com is allowed and you have an asterisk here, that could be the reason that it's allowing chat, because if the asterisk is before or right after the slash, then anything after that is going to be allowed. And so that would be conflicting with the chat. That's why it's probably allowing the chat. So you would want to just get rid of mail.google.com. If Yeah, so give that a try and see if that helps. Okay. Well, listen, everybody, thanks so much for coming and being a part of this. And as we continue to roll out, any questions that come up, please feel free to drop me a note, or if you want to schedule a time to sit down and visit and work on building a list or looking at the data, um, happy to do that with you. All right. Have a great rest of the day. Yep. Yes. Yep. That's a good question.